This is Dr. George Morris, and this is the President's Newsletter for the Medical Society of Milwaukee County, October 2010. I'm joined today by Dr. Bruce Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the recent contributor of an editorial to the Journal Sentinel editorial page about end-of-life decision-making. And I thought it would be useful for us to have him talk a little bit about that subject, as it's become a very important subject in medicine, and one that has raised people's awareness at the same time it seems to raise their hackles. Dr. Wilson, the editorial talked about the nature of end-of-life decision-making. What do you think we should be doing about these end-of-life decisions?
Well, a lot more than we are doing. My interest in this stems back to an experience I had in medical school on about my third day on the wards. I was on an oncology ward at a large university hospital, and I was not taking care of this particular patient. He was on the other team, if you will, and he was a young man who was 19 who was dying of widely metastatic colon cancer. Very sad story, and he was in the university hospital for intrahepatic 5-FU infusion, which was a big fancy thing we were doing back then, and may still be doing, I'm not sure, not being an oncologist. And we were leaving his room on the third day of the rotation, and the doctors who were on his team looked down at this poor little kid and said, "You're going home tomorrow, we're all done with the infusion, so congratulations, you can go home." And he didn't say anything, as he never said anything, from a small town. And imagine being a 19-year-old in a big university hospital. And I was the last person out of the room, and he turned to me and he said, "Hey, Doc." And I looked around to see if there was a doctor in the room, of course. He said, "Hey, Doc." And I said, "Yeah, Joe." And he said, "What's going to happen to me?" So it hit me like a bowling ball, you know. What do I say to this poor kid? Apparently they haven't said anything to him except, "We put all the poison in, you can go home tomorrow." And so I went back to the station. I said, "Hang on, I'll see if I can get someone to talk to you." I went back to the attending physician and the fellow and the resident who were there, and I said, "Joe back in 249 just asked me what's going to happen to him. I don't think anyone has spoken to him. Someone needs to go talk to him." And my attending said to me, "You seem to have a special knack for these kinds of things." After 3 days on the ward, and it was the other team. Translation here, 4th and 23, you know, time to punt. He said, "You have a special knack for this, it seems to me. Why don't you go talk to him?" So it struck me immediately, excuse me, that it was unfair to me, but it was really unfair to this patient. He needed to understand that this disease was going to kill him, and no one had spoken with him. So this is a much longer story, but it woke me up immediately to there's this gaping need that we have, and people need to be coached in the last chapter. So I've always felt that I noticed as I went through my training that we don't have any formal training about this, that we are trained to fight off death all the time at any cost. And you know, as I went along my career and became a cardiologist, I was asked a number of times to put pacemakers in people who were very clearly in the last moments of their life. And, you know, I think what we have on our hands now is the fact that 30, 40 years ago, we died of heart attacks and strokes and accidents. And no one knew what to do. There was no CPR, there was no 911, there was no paramedics, there were no trauma centers. And now we've gotten very, very good at stopping that process. We can take care of those things, and a very small percentage of people die from those things now. But now we're stuck with diseases that take a very long time to kill us. And as we're so busy fighting off this thing called death, we've gone overboard, and we haven't really attended to, well, what would someone's needs actually be when it's inevitable that they're going to die? And are they going to die today, or are they going to die next week, or next month, or next year? I think it's time for us to train ourselves better to help someone in that last chapter, not by poisoning them more or operating on them more, but by meeting their needs and their family's needs.
So This is about training the physician to be able to relate to the patient at that moment in their life where they have to learn about the fact that life comes to an end.
They do, and we need a little learning in that department too.
No doubt, no doubt. The Wisconsin Medical Society actually had advanced a system for looking at those end-of-life decisions called the posts, and the idea was that we would have a statewide, standardized kind of approach to this whole process. But that's just a form, and what you're talking about is a completely different thing, which is educating people how to communicate about a very specific moment.
That's exactly right. And sometimes we refer to this as the conversation. And sometimes that means the conversation that we as physicians have with our patients. And sometimes that's a conversation that the patient has with his or her family. But the bigger conversation that needs to occur earlier is at the patient-family level. One way to get around all of the trouble at end of life, where most of the money spent is in the last chapter. The 80-20 rule or the 55 rule or whatever the rule is, we're very lopsided. We spend a lot of money on people who are very terminally ill, and we're broke. The system is broke because of it. So we'd like to not have this economic burden, number one. Number two, we'd like to not be so afraid of this, but it's so unfamiliar to us now. In the old days, we lived on farms, and Grandpa fell off the tractor, had a heart attack, and you drag him out of the field, and you call the doc, and the doc says, yep, he's dead. And the undertaker comes over and puts him in his blue suit, and they put him on the dining room table and had a bunch of whiskey, and you put him in the ground tomorrow. But now death is so unfamiliar to us. There are many children who have never seen a dead person. 25% of medical students in 4 years never observe a death. So it's become so unfamiliar. And what happens in our brains, you might know something about this, but our brains, when they see unfamiliar, go on alert. We get a response like we need a fight or flight response because it's unfamiliar.
So going forward, I think the Medical Society has been, Milwaukee County has been working on better communication forms, but I agree, some sort of systematic training program for physicians to help them to not only help them communicate with the patient's family, but also help the family communicate so that their expectations don't lead them to egregious breaches of humanity in those last 6 months of life.
That's right. We have a concept called medical futility, where it is no longer really appropriate to apply more technology to somebody who's at the end. And if people watch television, everybody gets cured and walks out in about 4 minutes. So our whole culture needs to change. The physicians need to change. We need to stop fighting it off at any cost, because it maybe is a fear that we have that we've lost and we aren't as good as we could be. We have to confront that. And the patients and their families have to learn that this unknown is something that, like, taxes, this is for sure. And we do need a system, but we already have a pretty good system. We need to engage in it. First, the doctors need to learn more about hospice and palliative care, because these programs address these needs very well. And the average time spent in hospice up until a couple of years ago was about 2 days. And it's very frequent that someone is placed in hospice at the very end of their life and have a little morphine and have a little something so your secretions dry up. But we really need to have hospice and palliative care come in at the last chapter. So that means we need to learn about hospice and palliative care, what the services are, how effective it is. The patients need to be told about this, and hospice is not giving up and throwing in the towel. It's a better treatment in the last chapter. Meet people's spiritual needs and their family needs and their medical needs. And then the doctors need to learn that if this is too hard for us to have this conversation with a patient, let's get the palliative care people or the hospice people involved who do know how to have this conversation. And then the last thing I'd say is the most important conversation comes when patients, who most of the time know they don't want this, this, and this at the end of life. They've seen it. It's been a horror to them. A friend, a family member has had the medical system sort of assault them, and they need to learn how to have the conversation with their families. I would never want that. Now, why is that so important? This is the most important thing I could say. That's so important so the family all understands very clearly what the wishes would be, because at the moment of death, or the hour of death, or the week of death, emotions run high, people are afraid, there's loss all over the place, and people are afraid, and so they can't make a good, rational decision. So if the people talk to their families, and I tell elderly people, have this conversation with your family on your birthday every year. So there's no doubt when the time comes, so we don't have one daughter who's saying, oh no, do everything because I'm going to miss mom too much.
Well, I think that some sort of potentially even mandate of a portion of our CME accreditation as physicians each year might be well applied to a palliative care program. This is Dr. George Morris. This is October's President's Video Newsletter, and I'm suggesting and in fact even imploring you as physicians to become more aware and more engaged in palliative care. Thank you.